She built a shelter from broken boards, unaware her dead husband's brother was watching. What he discovered would change everything. The sun was just rising over the towering Colorado mountains, casting a soft orange glow over the autumn leaves. In the distance, a woman worked alone, her hands bleeding as she hammered wooden planks into place. Catherine Brennan, widowed for 6 weeks, was struggling to survive. Her husband, Thomas, was dead, and with winter fast approaching, she had no choice but to finish building the shelter. But she didn't know she wasn't alone. James Brennan, her late husband's brother, stood hidden in the trees, rifle in hand. His mission was clear: to confront Catherine and discover the truth about his brother's death. What he saw, however, would shake him to his core. The morning air was crisp, and the faint sound of hammering echoed through the valley. Catherine worked tirelessly, her clothes darkened by sweat and dirt. She had no choice but to finish the shelter. She had the land deed, her only hope for survival. But with it, the weight of uncertainty and fear was heavy on her shoulders. Her hands were raw from the constant effort, but she kept going. From a distance, James watched her, hidden behind a line of tall pines. He gripped his rifle, every muscle tense. He had come all the way from Missouri, expecting to find the woman who killed his brother. The letters Thomas had sent before his death were clear. Don't trust her. James had every reason to believe that Catherine was responsible for Thomas's sudden death. But as he watched her struggle, something inside him shifted. She was alone, desperate. James could see the exhaustion and pain on her face. She didn't look like a murderer. She looked like a woman trying to survive in a world that had turned against her. The more he watched, the more his anger gave way to something he couldn't name. His backstory echoed in his mind. Thomas had always been the golden child, the one their father adored. James had always been the disappointment. But now, as he observed Catherine, he wondered if things were as they seemed. James had followed Catherine for 3 days. The journey had been long, the terrain harsh, but nothing compared to the turmoil he felt inside. He couldn't shake the image of his brother's death. Thomas had been a pillar of their family, and now he was gone. The family had received no body, no witnesses, only a cryptic letter from Thomas. His last words were a warning to James: don't trust her. The more he observed Catherine, the more conflicted he became. She was clearly struggling, building this shelter out of the remnants of an abandoned homestead. Her hands bled from the effort, and her body was weak. Yet, James couldn't reconcile this image with the woman he had been told was responsible for his brother's death. He had expected to find a cold, calculating murderer. Instead, he found a woman on the edge, barely holding on. Thomas's letter had painted a picture of Catherine as a manipulator, a woman capable of betrayal. But James couldn't deny what he was seeing. The woman before him wasn't a villain. She was just a widow. And yet, Thomas's warning haunted him. Could she be telling the truth? James shifted uncomfortably behind the trees, the rifle in his hand heavy with doubt. He had come here for answers, but all he had was more questions. Had Thomas been wrong about her? Was she innocent, or was she hiding something darker? Catherine paused for a moment, resting against the makeshift frame she had been building. Her ankle ached, and the pain in her hands was unbearable, but she couldn't stop. Winter was coming fast, and without a proper shelter, she would freeze. The deed to the land in her pocket was her only claim to survival. She had to finish what Thomas had started. It had been 6 weeks since Thomas had died. She had found him cold and lifeless in their bed, his last breath a rasping whisper of confusion. She had tried to save him, but it was too late. He had been ill for weeks, feverish and paranoid. He had told her strange things in his delirium, his thoughts scattered between nightmares and fevered ramblings. But there was one thing he had made her promise before he died: get to Colorado, find the land, and build a life. She had honored that promise, even though everything was falling apart. The land was hers now, but she had no way to make it a home. The shelter was her only chance, and even with her injuries, she kept working. Her hands trembled with the weight of grief and exhaustion, but she kept going. Catherine's thoughts turned to the past, the memories of Thomas and their life together. They had come to this place to escape, to build a future. But it had all turned into something unrecognizable. His paranoia had consumed him. He had feared something, someone, but never told her who. His last words to her were spoken in a feverish delirium, "Elena." And then there was the shoe, a child's shoe, half buried in the rubble. It was the first sign she had found of someone else living in the ruins. Someone had been here recently. The sun was slipping behind the mountains, and Catherine's energy was fading. She had hammered in the last of the boards, her body trembling with exhaustion. She tried to stand, but her twisted ankle buckled beneath her, and she collapsed. That was when she heard it, a sound from behind her, the soft crunch of boots on the ground. She looked up to see him standing there, a tall figure in dark clothing, holding a rifle. Her heart raced. She recognized him immediately. James Brennan, her late husband's brother. "You're Thomas's brother," she said, struggling to stand. "And you're his widow." "Convenient," he replied, his tone cold, distrustful. Catherine's throat went dry. "What do you want?" James stepped closer, his rifle still pointed at the ground, but his eyes hard. "The truth, starting with how he died." Catherine's gaze flickered to the rifle, then back to James's face. She had been expecting this confrontation, but now that it was here, she felt the weight of it crushing her. "I was there. I watched him die." James lowered his rifle slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Then you'll tell me exactly what happened. Every detail." Catherine tried to rise on her injured ankle, but the pain was too much. She fell again, and James was there, catching her, but only for a moment. They both recoiled from the unexpected contact. "You came all this way to build this?" His voice was full of disbelief. "I had nowhere else to go," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "Your brother made me promise." James's expression softened, just for a second. "Thomas is dead. I know. I was there." James took a step back, his rifle still clutched in his hand, but his grip on it seemed looser. "Then you're going to tell me exactly what happened. Every detail." The tension hung in the air, and for the first time, both of them seemed to realize that the truth might be something neither of them were ready to hear. James stood, staring down at Catherine, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hand. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts, but he couldn't walk away. There was something in her eyes, a weariness that mirrored his own. She was a widow, struggling to survive in a harsh, unforgiving world. He had come here expecting to find a cold, calculating murderer, but what he found was far more complicated. A woman, injured, broken, alone, fighting for her life. He couldn't leave her die. Despite all the suspicion and anger he carried from his brother's death, he knew he had no choice. "I'll help you finish the shelter. Then we talk," he said, his voice rough. Catherine didn't protest. She was too exhausted to argue, and for a moment, the silence between them felt heavy with the weight of shared loss. As they worked side by side, James couldn't help but notice her hands, gripped with determination, yet bleeding from the effort. She had no training, no experience, yet she built like someone who had no other choice but to succeed. She was far from the helpless woman Thomas had described. She was resourceful, capable, and determined to survive. He couldn't reconcile this version of Catherine with the one his brother had warned him about. He had come to Colorado with a mission, to avenge his brother's death, to uncover the truth. But now, as he worked beside her, he wasn't so sure. Every time she spoke, every time she moved, James saw something that didn't add up. His thoughts were interrupted when Catherine suddenly looked up at him, her expression tired but earnest. "You know, Thomas never mentioned you could build," she said, her voice soft. "He always said you were good for nothing, just a worker, never good enough for anything more." The words hit James harder than he expected, but he refused to let it show. He wasn't a golden child like Thomas. He wasn't the one everyone had expected to succeed. But he had his pride, and that meant something to him. I was good at other things, he said, his voice flat. Building was never one of them. But now I can see how he managed it all. Catherine nodded slowly, glancing at him, then back at the shelter. You're good with your hands. You're different from what I expected. James didn't respond, his thoughts drifting back to the letter Thomas had written. He had never known Thomas to speak of Catherine with any real affection. He had been obsessed with something else, something he couldn't understand. There was something about Thomas's final months that didn't make sense, and Catherine, for all her apparent innocence, was at the center of it. So, tell me, James said after a long pause, his voice carefully controlled. What exactly happened? Why did Thomas die? What was he really afraid of? Catherine hesitated. She didn't want to relive it, but the questions hung in the air unanswered. She looked down at the ground, then began speaking, her voice soft and reluctant. We weren't always like this. I was just a factory worker, a carpenter's daughter. Thomas found me, and he swept me off my feet. He was charming, educated, promised me a better life. I thought he was my escape. She paused, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing the past unfold before her. We got married quickly. It was all too fast. But when we started traveling west, it wasn't what I thought it would be. The journey was hard, and Thomas started to change. He became paranoid, afraid of something. I didn't know what it was. He started talking about debts, broken promises. He never told me who he was running from, but he always had this fear. James listened, his expression unreadable. His brother had always been the picture of control, the one who had everything figured out. The Thomas Catherine described was a stranger, someone who didn't match the image James had in his mind. Then he fell ill, Catherine continued. It was sudden. He got a fever. He was delirious. He kept saying things that didn't make sense. And before he died, he made me promise to come here, to find this land and build something. Her voice trembled at the last part, and James felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She had no idea what she was walking into, no idea what was really going on. What did he say? James asked, his voice low. What was the promise? Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, as though summoning the memory. He said something about Elena. Her name. I don't know who she was, but he said her name right before he died. Elena, he said. It was the last thing he ever said to me. James's breath caught in his chest. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. He had heard it before. Thomas had never mentioned it, but now it felt like a thread pulling at something deep inside him. Elena, he repeated, almost to himself. Who was she? Catherine shook her head. I don't know, but it was clear she meant something to him. Maybe more than me. James felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to feel sympathy for her, but it was hard to ignore the grief in her voice. Thomas's death hadn't been just about survival for her. It had been about love and loss. I'm sorry, he said, his voice soft. You didn't deserve any of this. Catherine gave him a small, sad smile. None of us did, she replied, her gaze falling to the ground. But we have to move forward, don't we? Before James could respond, something caught his eye, something small, hidden beneath the floorboards of the shelter. He crouched down, his hands brushing away the dirt and debris. There, wedged between the wooden planks, was a bundle of letters. He pulled them out, his heart racing. These weren't just any letters. They were addressed to someone named Elena. His fingers trembled as he opened the first one, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting of his brother. Catherine stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. What is it? She asked, her voice tense. James held up the first letter, his voice tight. Thomas, he had another woman. Her name was Elena. He wrote to her, and now, it seems he left everything for her. This land was meant for Elena, not for you. Catherine's face went pale, and for a moment, the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice cracking. James continued reading aloud, each word revealing more than he had expected. The letters were full of confusion. Thomas had written them before he left, detailing his regrets, his pain, and his obsession with Elena. She was the love of his life, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. And he thought you were her. Catherine stumbled back, her hands shaking. She felt sick, as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. She had been Thomas's second choice. She wasn't his true love. She was a replacement, someone who looked like Elena. It all made sense now. Thomas had never really seen her. He had seen someone else in her, someone he couldn't have. And now, Catherine was left to pick up the pieces of a life that was never truly hers to begin with. She collapsed onto the floor, her tears falling freely. James didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent. It wasn't his place to comfort her, but something inside him shifted. She wasn't just Thomas's widow. She was a woman who had been left behind, a woman who had been lied to. He knelt down beside her, awkwardly reaching out to her as she cried. He didn't know how to help, but he couldn't stand seeing her in pain. "You're not her," he said softly. "You're not a replacement. You're real, more real than anything Thomas ever touched." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Catherine looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. For a moment, they were close, closer than they had ever been. And then there was a sound, a noise in the distance. Horses approaching. James's hand immediately went to his rifle, his body tense. "Stay quiet," he whispered, positioning Catherine behind him. She pressed herself against the wall of the shelter, her heart pounding. James's eyes scanned the trees, his mind racing. The riders were getting closer. The storm had arrived. The sound of horses approaching grew louder, and the weight of impending danger pressed heavily on James's chest. He instinctively positioned himself between Catherine and the riders, his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes scanning the tree-line. The last few days had been a blur of emotions, suspicions, and revelations. Every day spent with Catherine had only deepened the mystery surrounding Thomas's death and the secrets that had been buried along with him. For the first time, James wasn't sure where the truth began and where it ended. Who was Thomas really? Was he the golden son everyone had believed him to be? Or was he something else? A man with dark secrets. Someone whose death wasn't as simple as it seemed. Catherine's face, pale and tear-streaked, haunted James's thoughts. She wasn't just the widow trying to survive. She was someone who had been lied to, used as a replacement for a love that had long since been lost. Her grief wasn't just for Thomas. It was for the truth she had never been told. The riders were getting closer now, and James could hear the distinct sound of hooves crunching on the cold earth. His grip on the rifle tightened. If this was Marcus Tully, Thomas's business partner, he would have to act fast. Marcus's men were dangerous. There was no telling what they would do to get what they wanted. Catherine's hand reached for James's arm, her touch tentative. She didn't speak, but the question in her eyes was clear. What were they going to do? "Stay quiet," James whispered, his voice low but firm. He could feel her breath against his back as she nodded. Her body was stiff with fear, but she remained close, trusting him to protect her. He wasn't sure why he was doing it. He had come here to avenge his brother's death, to confront Catherine and uncover the truth. But now it felt like something else entirely. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't leave her alone to face whatever was coming. James's mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. He had no idea what Marcus wanted, but he knew it wouldn't be good. His father's favor had always gone to Thomas, and James had been left behind to deal with the land and the responsibilities no one else cared to. Now, it seemed his brother's past had come back to haunt him, and it was taking Catherine down with it. The riders were almost upon them, and James's muscles tensed in preparation. He had to be ready. He couldn't afford to hesitate. As the riders broke through the trees and into the clearing, James's heart skipped a beat. The man leading them was tall, sharp-featured, and impeccably dressed in dark clothing. His eyes were cold, calculating, a man who had seen and done things that made men like James recoil. Marcus Tully, James realized with a sick feeling in his gut. Behind Marcus were two others, burly, hard-faced men. their hands resting on the handles of their revolvers. They were here for a reason, and James had no doubt it wasn't good for him or Catherine. "Mrs. Brennan," Marcus said smoothly, his voice a mix of respect and cold calculation. "A resilient woman, I see." Catherine didn't respond at first, her voice a whisper of disbelief as she stood next to James. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus's gaze flickered to James for a brief moment, and then back to Catherine. "What Thomas took from me," he replied, his smile sharp and dangerous. "I'm here for what's mine." James's grip on his rifle tightened, but he remained silent, his body coiled and ready for anything. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she stepped slightly forward, her face pale. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's smile widened as he took a step closer. "Thomas stole $10,000 in gold certificates from me," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Money that was never his to take. I want it back, or your little shelter here becomes your grave." The words hit James like a blow to the chest. He had known Thomas had been involved in something shady, but this was worse than he had imagined. The gold certificates were worth far more than Catherine could ever hope to repay, and Marcus wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to collect. James stepped forward, blocking Marcus's path. "You're on my land now," he said, his voice low but firm, "and I'm telling you to leave. Now." Marcus chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Your land," he repeated. "Check those papers again, James. This land belongs to me." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of legal papers, tossing them onto the ground in front of James. James bent down slowly, his gaze flicking between the papers and Marcus's smirking face. He felt the blood drain from his face as he read the words. The deed that Catherine had was worthless. Thomas had mortgaged the land as collateral for his gambling debts. The gold certificates Marcus was after were a direct consequence of Thomas's actions. James felt a surge of anger, but he kept it buried, focusing on the task at hand. If they didn't do something, they would lose everything. Marcus's men were already eyeing them with a predatory gaze, and it was clear they were prepared to fight for what they believed was rightfully theirs. "I don't care what your papers say," James said, his voice sharp. "Leave. Now." Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, James thought he might pull a gun. But instead, he merely laughed, his voice cold and taunting. "You think you could just tell me to leave?" he asked, his tone mocking. "I'm not leaving until I get what's mine. And if you don't want to see your land burned to the ground, I suggest you find those certificates quickly. You have a week. After that, everything goes to me. The land, the cabin, your little widow here." Catherine stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "You can't just take everything," she whispered. "Thomas owed you nothing. He owed me everything," Marcus replied, his voice growing colder. "Now, you have until the end of the week to make this right." With that, Marcus turned on his heel and began to walk away, his men following closely behind. As they disappeared into the trees, James stood frozen, the weight of the situation sinking in. "We can't let them take everything," Catherine said, her voice a mix of determination and fear. "We need to find those certificates. We have no choice." James turned to her, his mind already racing with possibilities. He knew where the certificates were. They were hidden in Thomas's belongings. There was no time to waste. They had to find them before Marcus did, or else everything they had fought for would be lost. "We'll find them," James said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "We'll get to Denver, and we'll get those certificates. We'll save the land, and we'll make sure Marcus doesn't get a damn thing." Catherine looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. She nodded, her chin trembling. "Then let's go," she said, her voice barely audible. And with that, they set to work. It was time to search through Thomas's belongings, to tear through the journals and letters, to find whatever they could before it was too late. There was no turning back now. The quiet had barely settled in when James and Catherine began their frantic search. The papers Marcus had dropped seemed to burn in James's hands, the cold truth of Thomas's betrayal sinking deeper with every word. Marcus Tully had left with the promise of reclaiming what was owed to him: the gold certificates, the money that Thomas had gambled away in a desperate attempt to escape his past, a past that now threatened to consume them both. James wasn't sure what to feel: rage at his brother for putting them in this position, fear at what Marcus might do, or a strange sense of helplessness that gnawed at him. But the most pressing feeling was the cold, hard determination to fix things, to salvage whatever he could of this life and the land Thomas had left behind. Catherine was already rummaging through Thomas's trunk, her movements quick but methodical, as if she could still hear his voice in her head, guiding her. "He must have hidden it somewhere," she muttered, her fingers trembling as she flipped through old letters and receipts. James crouched beside her, his own hands shaking slightly as he opened the worn leather saddlebag. Inside, he found more of Thomas's belongings: journals, a few tools, a pair of boots. Nothing that stood out, nothing that gave them the clue they desperately needed. "We need to get to the journal," James said, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "The journal will have the answers. We know that's where Thomas kept everything: his plans, his secrets. We need it." Catherine nodded, her face pale with fear, but her eyes determined. She had come a long way since that first day in the shelter, from a woman barely holding on to someone who was ready to fight for what she had left. The hours dragged on, the sun sinking lower, casting long shadows across the small cabin as they tore through every bag, every corner of the room. The tension between them was palpable, the quiet punctuated only by the rustle of paper and the occasional clink of metal. "I found it." Catherine's voice broke the silence, and James turned quickly to see her holding up the familiar leather-bound journal. It was thick, worn from use, and heavy with secrets. She flipped it open, her hands trembling slightly as she scanned the pages. For a moment, the room was still, as if the journal itself held the answers to everything. "There's something here," she said, her voice low and cautious. "A map. Thomas had a map in here, marked with different locations. Look." She handed James the journal, and his eyes traced the ink on the yellowing pages. There were several locations, each one circled in red ink, with cryptic notes scribbled beside them. One of the circles was near Denver, the same city Marcus had mentioned. The thought of reaching Denver quickly, before Marcus, made James's heart race. But they had no horses, no way of getting there fast enough. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't act soon, Marcus would beat them to the certificates. "We need to move fast," James said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We can't waste any more time." Catherine nodded, already pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "I'll get the map," she said, as if the next step was already etched in her mind. James watched her for a moment, then grabbed his rifle and checked it one last time. They were about to embark on a dangerous journey, one that could end in bloodshed or worse. They couldn't afford to fail. The journey to Denver would be difficult, and they would have to stay ahead of Marcus's men. James could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had already lost so much: his family, his future, his brother. But now, he had Catherine, and he would protect her at all costs. They didn't speak much as they prepared to leave, but the urgency was there, silent but pressing. James mounted one of the horses, adjusting his saddle and checking the reins. Catherine hesitated for a moment before following suit, her face determined but wary. She wasn't a rider, not like him, but she had no choice now. They had to get to Denver before Marcus. The storm outside had worsened, the wind howling through the trees, and the sky darkening with thick clouds. It would make their journey even more perilous, but they had no other option. They had to push forward. As they rode out of the clearing and into the dense forest, James kept his eyes sharp, his senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every rustling of leaves put him on edge. He had no doubt that Marcus's men were nearby, waiting for any opportunity to catch them off guard. The only thing they had in their favor was the knowledge of the land, and even that was limited. They couldn't afford any mistakes. Hours passed as they rode through the forest, the trees looming overhead, their branches creaking in the wind. Catherine struggled to keep up, but James kept a steady pace, urging her to stay close. He knew the path was dangerous, but he couldn't afford to go slower. "Stay with me," he called back to her, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "We can't stop until we reach Denver." Catherine nodded, but the strain on her face was evident. She wasn't used to the harsh conditions, but she kept pushing herself forward, determined not to fall behind. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, the cold air biting into their skin. Every so often, James would glance back at Catherine, making sure she was still behind him. It was clear that she was exhausted, but she refused to stop. They had no choice but to keep going. The wind began to pick up, the snow starting to fall in thick, heavy flakes. Visibility was becoming more difficult, and James knew they had to find shelter soon. But there was no time for that. They had to make it to Denver. The thought of Marcus's men following them kept James on edge, his mind racing with possibilities. They couldn't afford to stop, not until they reached their destination. When they finally emerged from the forest and saw the faint outline of the town in the distance, it felt like a small victory. But they still had a long way to go. James spurred his horse forward, urging it into a gallop. Catherine struggled to keep up, but she was determined. She could see the light from the town now, flickering in the distance. Denver was within reach. But Marcus and his men were still out there, and they weren't far behind. As they reached the outskirts of town, James urged the horse to slow. They had to blend in to make sure they weren't spotted. The streets were busy, filled with people hurrying to their destinations, oblivious to the danger that was about to follow. "We'll need to find a place to stay," James said, glancing over at Catherine. "Keep your head down. Don't draw attention." Catherine nodded, her eyes wide with apprehension. She wasn't used to this kind of life. The danger, the constant fear of being hunted. But she was learning, and she was learning fast. They found a modest boarding house on a side street, one that was far from the main roads. The landlady gave them a wary look, but didn't ask too many questions. She led them to a small room at the back of the house, where they could rest and regroup. James made sure the door was locked and the windows secured before he sat down by the fire, his eyes scanning the room. They had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead of them. They couldn't stay long. Marcus would be looking for them, and they had to find the gold certificates before it was too late. They were on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. But for now, they had a brief moment of safety, and in that moment, James couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They were still in this together. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the small boarding house room where James and Catherine had spent the night. The muffled sounds of the bustling city outside, a sharp contrast to the quiet tension inside. They had only a few hours to prepare before heading to the bank. Marcus and his men were out there, likely closing in on their every move, and James's nerves were stretched taut with the thought of what they might face. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "We have to get those certificates today," James said, his voice low, as he quickly checked his rifle, his eyes scanning the room for anything they might have missed. Catherine was already getting dressed, her movements quick but deliberate, as if she knew exactly what needed to be done. Despite the fear and exhaustion in her eyes, there was a new strength in her, a determination that had grown over the past days. "We will," she replied, glancing at him as she finished adjusting her dress. "But we need to be careful. Marcus won't stop until he gets what he wants." James nodded, his jaw clenched. He knew that, but he couldn't let fear dictate their actions. If they were going to survive this, they had to stay one step ahead of Marcus, and that meant getting to the gold certificates before anyone else. They left the boarding house just as the streets began to fill with the early morning crowd. Denver, bustling and alive, felt like a different world from the desolate cabin they had come from. People walked along the sidewalks, horses clopped against the cobblestones, and the smells of fresh bread and coffee wafted through the air. But James couldn't relax. His senses were on high alert, watching for any signs that Marcus's men were close. Catherine walked beside him, her head down, trying to keep a low profile. They weren't in the clear yet. As they made their way to the bank, James's mind raced with what would happen once they got there. He knew that getting the gold certificates was only part of the battle. The bigger fight was going to be facing Marcus and his men when they inevitably caught up with them. When they reached the bank, they entered cautiously, the heavy wooden door closing behind them with a soft creak. The interior was stark and professional, with brass fixtures and tall, arched windows that led in the morning sunlight. The clerk behind the counter gave them a polite but curt greeting. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat, professional. Catherine stepped forward, her hand slipping in her bag, pulling out the claim ticket that Thomas had left behind. She handed it to the clerk, her fingers trembling slightly as she did so. "We're here to retrieve a deposit," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. The clerk nodded and motioned for them to wait. He disappeared behind a set of doors that led to a back office, leaving James and Catherine in the main room. James's gaze darted around the space, watching for any signs of trouble. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. The tension between him and Catherine was thick, but neither of them said anything, both lost in their own thoughts. After what seemed like hours, the clerk returned with a small box in his hands, the gold certificates inside, along with a letter. The box was placed on the counter, and Catherine immediately reached for it, her eyes scanning it for any signs of tampering. James leaned in closer, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of the moment. The letters from Thomas, the map they had found, the promise to get the certificates. They were finally holding them in their hands. Catherine carefully lifted the certificates, her fingers brushing the paper as if she were holding something fragile, something precious. Then she pulled out the letter that had been with them. James reached for it, his heart racing as he tore open the envelope. The letter inside was written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, but the words felt distant, almost like they belonged to a different person. James read it aloud, his voice tight with emotion. "James, if you're reading this, I'm dead. You probably hate me for what I've done, but there are things you need to know. Elena was real. I loved her, and when she died, I couldn't face it. I thought I could replace her with Catherine. She looked like her, but I was wrong. I was always wrong. She deserves better than this life I dragged her into." The words hit James hard, each one a reminder of how twisted his brother's life had become. He felt a wave of anger, followed by a deep sadness. "I didn't want to leave you with nothing," the letter continued. "I stole the money, and I gambled it all away. But the land is yours, always was. If you find Catherine, protect her. She's innocent, and I failed her." The letter ended there, and James felt a lump form in his throat. His brother's confession, the truth that had been hidden for so long, was now laid bare. Catherine was no longer just a widow. She was a woman caught in a web of lies, a woman who had been left with nothing but a promise. James looked at her, his emotions tangled. He loved her, Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. He loved Elena, and I was just a substitute. James shook his head, his hand resting on her shoulder. "No," he said softly. "You weren't a substitute. You were real. You're real." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and for a moment, the world outside the bank faded away. But their quiet moment didn't last long. As they turned to leave, the doors of the bank swung open, and a familiar face stepped inside. Marcus Tully, along with two of his men, walked in with a menacing calm. The air grew tense, the weight of their presence enough to freeze the blood in James's veins. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he locked gazes with James, a smirk curling on his lips. Well, what have we here?" he drawled. "Seems like you found what you're looking for." James's hand instinctively went to his rifle, But Marcus was quicker, his men already reaching for their guns. The room was now a standoff, a battle for everything they had fought for. "We don't want trouble, Marcus," James said, his voice steady but filled with underlying tension. "We've got the certificates. This is over." Marcus chuckled, his voice dark. "Oh, I think not," he said, stepping closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You see, I'm not just going to walk away. You owe me more than just a few pieces of paper. And if you think you can walk out of here without paying the price, you're sadly mistaken." James's fingers tightened around the rifle, ready for whatever was about to come. Catherine stepped back, her breath catching in her throat as Marcus's men drew their weapons. This was it, the moment they had been dreading. A showdown was inevitable. James knew they had no choice but to fight. The world seemed to slow as the tension reached its peak. James took a deep breath, ready to do whatever it took to protect Catherine, to protect the land Thomas had left behind, and to make sure Marcus didn't take everything from them. "You'll have to kill me first," James said, his voice cold and unwavering. And then, with the sound of a gunshot, everything changed. The sheriff's voice rang out from the doorway, drawing everyone's attention. "Hold it right there," he shouted, his hand on his gun, his eyes cold and calculating. The standoff ended in an instant, but the cost of victory was far from clear. The chaos of the confrontation seemed to vanish as quickly as it had erupted, the sharp crack of the gunfire lingering in the air like a forgotten warning. Marcus's men, startled by the sudden appearance of the sheriff, froze in place, their hands still hovering over their weapons, unsure of how to proceed. The sheriff's eyes flicked over them, his gaze unwavering, a man who had seen countless standoffs and knew how to handle them. His voice was low but firm. "Drop your weapons, gentlemen. Now." For a moment, it seemed like no one would move, but then, with a reluctant gesture, Marcus's men complied, their guns falling to the floor with a clatter that seemed far too loud in the tense silence. Marcus himself didn't immediately speak, his jaw tight with frustration. The situation had turned against him, and it was clear from a hard set of his features that he wasn't happy about it. But he knew better than to push his luck. The sheriff wasn't a man who tolerated threats or violence in his town, and his presence now made it clear that Marcus's claim to the gold certificates and to Catherine and James had just been obliterated. "You're under arrest, Marcus Tully," the sheriff said, his voice carrying an edge of finality, "for theft, assault, and attempted murder. You and your men are coming with me." The reality of the moment began to settle in as Marcus's defiance crumbled, and he was escorted out of the bank, his hands cuffed, his expression one of bitter defeat. James watched, his heart still racing from the intensity of the standoff. The sheriff's intervention had saved them, but it hadn't erased the strain of the last few days. As the dust settled, James turned to Catherine, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the chaos had erupted. There's a moment of silence between them, and then, almost as if on instinct, they reached for each other. For the first time since they'd met, there was no tension, no suspicion, just the undeniable relief of having survived, of having made it through. "It's over," James whispered, his voice hoarse, and Catherine nodded, her face flushed with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "It's over," she repeated softly. For a long moment, they stood there, their fingers intertwined, as the reality of what they had just endured began to sink in. The sheriff, now busy with his paperwork and the arrest of Marcus's men, gave them a quiet nod before heading out of the room. With the immediate threat gone, it was finally time to take a breath. James and Catherine were left alone in the bank, the weight of their journey and the secrets that had been uncovered hanging in the air between them. "We did it," Catherine said, a soft smile playing on her lips as she looked at James. "We actually did it." James smiled back, a slow, satisfied grin that reached his eyes. "Yeah," he said, "we did." The weight of the last few days, the constant fear, the near misses, the ever-present danger, was finally lifting. But there was something else in the air now, something new. It was the beginning of something, a life that had seemed impossible just days ago. "So what now?" Catherine asked, her voice quieter now, more contemplative. James hesitated, his gaze lingering on her as if seeing her for the first time in the light of everything they had just been through. "Now we go home," he said finally, the words carrying more weight than he'd intended. Catherine's eyes widened, a slight surprise in her expression. "Home," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "You mean back to the land?" James nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "To the land. If you want to." There was a pause, the space between them charged with a new kind of energy, and Catherine felt something inside her shift. She had been so focused on survival, on getting through the next day, the next moment, that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond that. But now, with the threat of Marcus gone, with the gold certificate secured, the possibility of a future, a real future, was finally within reach. She had a chance to build something, to create a life, a real life on the land that Thomas had left behind. She could feel it, a stirring deep inside her, a hope that had long been buried. And when she looked at James, she realized that he was the reason she had made it this far. He was the reason she had fought for her life, for this chance. "I want to," she said, her voice steady now, her heart full. James smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes. And for the first time, Catherine realized just how much they had both changed. They weren't the same people who had met in the wilderness, who had barely survived their first confrontation. They were stronger now, more sure of who they were and what they wanted. "Good," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Then let's go home." The journey back to the land was quieter than the one that had brought them to Denver. The wind still blew cold through the trees, but it felt different now, like the promise of something new was in the air. Catherine felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders with each passing mile. The shelter, the cabin, everything was hers now. They would rebuild it together, piece by piece, until it felt like home in every way. They arrived as the sun began to set, casting the landscape in soft, golden light. The cabin was just as they had left it, but it felt different now, as if it had been waiting for them to return. James dismounted and turned to Catherine, offering her a hand. "We're home," he said simply. She took his hand, feeling the warmth of it, the strength in it. And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. They walked into the cabin together, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space. They didn't need words. Everything had been said. As they moved through the cabin, unpacking their things, James began to work on the repairs that had been left undone. Catherine joined him, her hands eager to help, to build something new. The rhythm of their work was familiar now, comfortable. It was as if they had always been meant to do this together. Over the next few months, the cabin began to take shape. It wasn't just a place to survive anymore. It was becoming a home. The land, once barren and empty, began to bloom under their care. They planted a garden, repaired the fences, and worked side by side until it all felt right. And in the evenings, when the sun set and the work was done, they would sit by the fire, their hands intertwined, their hearts full. Catherine's dream of building something real was becoming a reality. And James, once a man who had believed he was destined to live in his brother's shadow, found a new purpose. They had both found a new beginning. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Catherine sat by the fire, her sewing needle in hand, as she mended a piece of clothing. James sat beside her, carving a piece of wood, the firelight flickering in his eyes. They were content. They were finally at peace. The world outside had changed, and so had they. Catherine looked up from her work, her eyes meeting James's. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked, her voice soft. "Thomas." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said, his voice gentle, "but less now." Catherine's gaze softened, a faint smile on her lips. "I used to hate him," she admitted, her voice tinged with sadness. Now I just pity him. James reached over, taking her hand in his. He gave us each other, he said softly, even if he didn't mean to. Catherine's smile deepened, her heart warm. That almost sounds like forgiveness. James chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe, or maybe just letting go. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. I'm glad I found you, James. He kissed her forehead gently. And I'm glad I stayed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the world quiet and still. Inside, the cabin was warm, filled with the sound of their breathing, their hearts beating in time. They had come full circle. They had faced the darkness, the lies, and the pain, and had built something stronger in its place. From ruins, they had built not just a shelter, but a home. And from betrayal, they had found something real. As they sat together in the soft glow of the fire, they knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together.